You've been using your brushes all wrong, and today we're gonna fix it. One of the most underrated skills in miniature painting is brush control, and painting with poor brush control will not only make you frustrated when painting, but it will also make your miniatures visibly worse, especially when it comes to paint application and detail control. And this is not something that you are the only one that has troubles with. This is something that I probably see on about 95% of all non-professionally painted miniatures. So don't worry if you're one of them, we're here to learn. The first and obvious thing that we do when we start painting miniature is rinsing the brush. And we make sure that it's really wet. But why do we do this? It is not just to remove the gum arabicum that comes with the brush from the factory. There's actually a few different reasons, because Kolinsky sable brushes are similar to human hair. And the water, for one, helps to keep the bristles together, tightens the hair into a nice fine tip. And when the brush is dry, the hairs will split. So every time you moisten it, the hairs come together and you get a super fine tip. But also we can use this water to keep the paint in the brush wet. It gives you a better paint release from the brush and it helps you thin the paints. So with that, one of the biggest problems that I see a ton of people do is they rinse the brush. And when you rinse it, it gets filled up with a little bit too much water. And when you have too much water, it doesn't hold the bristles together, it pushes them apart. So to remove the excess water, people bring in a paper towel to dry the brush. But what ends up happening is you can't really control how much water you withdraw from the brush, and almost every time you end up drying the brush too much, leaving your brush with nearly no water at all. And when you then add the paint with not enough water and you start painting, you're just gonna get a few strokes until the brush tip starts splitting because there's no moistness to hold the hairs together. On top of that, you're going to get some of that fiber from the paper towel into the brush, making it even more dry and messing up your hairs. Instead, what I tend to do, and haters are gonna hate, but to get the perfect amount of moistness in the brush, once I've cleaned it, I remove the excess water with my mouth. With that, I also reshape the brush to give it a perfect tip. I just have to make sure that I have clean water and no paint in the bristles when I do this. Everyone knows that 99% of your skills is depending on how well you lick the brush. But if that's a little bit too much for you to stomach, what you can do is you can use the palm of your hand. And when you remove the excess, you just want to pull it backwards a little bit like this. You still want water to release from the brush when you pull it back on your hand. Because if you do this too much on your hand, remove too much of the water, you're gonna see that it instantly starts splitting because there's not enough moistness to hold the bristles together. Whenever I do this, you can see that I always spin the brush backwards. And this is to reshape the tip and make sure that I always have a fine tip. This is probably the most common mistake and the one that I am referring to when I talk about that 99% of you are probably using your brushes all wrong, is you don't have enough moistness in the brush. And when we add the paint and we start painting, the second that we see that we don't have a good flow from the brush of paint, the bristles are gonna start splitting. Once we've added paint to the brush and you start painting on your miniature, the second that you see that the hairs start splitting, it means that you don't have enough moist left in there. And when we do that, we have to rinse the brush again and repeat the same process again, remove the excess water, and then bring in paint. But let's assume that we've loaded the brush with water properly. You have an amazing amount of water in there. And you start adding paint to the bristles. And when you start painting, even with that, it starts drying too fast. What could the problem possibly be? Well, for one of them, the paint on your palette could be a bit too old and a bit too dry. So the water to pigment ratio and medium ratio is a little bit off. The easiest way to fix that is by just adding another drop of paint on your palette. There's no reason for you to save those 3 cents by reusing the paint until you've run it through the ground. But it can also be that the water in your wet palette has started to dry out. And if you live in a dry environment like we do, we refill our wet palettes with water probably, every 30 to 60 minutes. And there's nothing wrong with that. You have to make sure that the palette is always wet. And when using acrylics and painting miniatures, you really have to use a wet palette, otherwise you're never gonna get the finest control of the paint. And you can make one at home for free, but there are also a couple of different ones that you can pick up on stores. As an example, we're making one with Red Dress Games that looks pretty freaking amazing. So if you want to check that one out, we'll put the link in the video description to where you can sign up for when it's gonna be released. But even then, when you are using the paintbrush and you feel like you're not getting the exact right control from rinsing the brush, removing the excess water and adding paints, I always tend to have a drop or two of water on my wet palette. So that way I can mix in a bit of that water into the brush as I'm painting. Once we've got this paint added in there, it's moist, we've re-moistened it with water on the palette, we just use the very fine tip of the brush and make brush strokes following the shape of the brush. So as you can see, I'm just pulling this backward as I'm painting. And while I paint on this mini, let me talk about this week's sponsor, Squarespace. You already know that on Squarespace you can make websites without any previous knowledge about web design or programming. But did you know that not too long ago, Squarespace completely updated their web design software with Blueprint AI that guides you through the process and makes making a website even easier. Even better yet, probably it's gonna look better too. So if you have a business or run a side hustle, it's never been easier to make your own platform. One of the things that we appreciated the more with Squarespace was that when we had our own website, it was so easy to make your own web store. The barrier of entry is literally next to nothing. You can try making your own website. It's completely free if you follow the link down below, squarespace.com/Squidmar, and then when you're ready to launch said website, just use the code Squidmar for 10% off your entire purchase of a website or a domain. And another small mistake that a lot of people do is they take a bit of paint like this, just push it in a little bit and then start painting. But to get the most from your paint, you need to stir in the paints properly into the bristles of the brush, because we want this paint to pretty much fill up the entire belly of the brush. That way we're gonna get a nice flow for a longer time and it's gonna last you a longer time before it dries. And whenever I feel like I'm not getting enough paint, again, I rinse the brush and I refill the brush with paints. Whenever you add paint to the brush as well, you can see that I'm spinning the brush backwards. Again, similarly to when we remove the water from the brush. Always want to reshape the brush as we're refilling it, as we're cleaning it, because we want to bring those hairs back to a perfect tip. And when you're painting and adding layers, you just want to learn to control the very finest tip of the brush. Whenever you're pulling backwards, you make sure that you can follow the shape of the miniature, and you want to learn kind of the distance between the tip of the brush and the handle. So you can get that fine control and make the perfect fine strokes on your mini. And the second that we see it start splitting, re-add water again. And when Lucas and I are painting for longer periods, we add another factor into the way that we paint, because often the rooms get very dry when we're painting for a long time. So we add an air humidifier to give us a few extra seconds to use the brush and bristles to keep the paints on the wet palette moist for a longer time. You might be fine with just painting as is, but if you live in a dry place, that's something to look into. You can find cheap humidifiers for 10-15 bucks somewhere around there. I've repeated a lot of times that I always pull the brush backwards when I paint. And unless you are a seasoned veteran, that is how you always want to move your brush, because if you start pushing the brush sideways, downwards, upwards, all kinds of ways, you're gonna see that it starts splitting way too fast. But of course, once you've painted for a long time and mastered the brush, you can start moving it and utilizing that split hair and the way that the brush flows if you push it sideways. But generally, keep in mind to just pull the brush backwards. And once you've followed these steps, you'll be able to improve quite fast. And maybe eventually you'll be able to get a brush control similar to what Jose da Vinci has. And if we have a shape like these leather straps here on top of the shoulder pad, where we want the highlight to go alongside horizontally instead of diagonally. Instead of having my mini like this and pushing the brush sideways, what I tend to do is just flip the miniature on the side, and then I can just pull the brush backwards towards me, following the shape of the bristles and giving me more control. And we've been talking mostly about Kolinsky sable brushes in this video, and the reason for that is there are no synthetic brushes or any natural hair brushes that we've found been able to match the quality of the Kolinsky sable. For one, they have the finest tips, which is for miniature painting pretty much the perfect thing to use, as you want to be able to reach into all those fine details and have control over those. But also what we've found is that the release of the paint, the way that the paint flows away from the brush, not just into it, is unmatched compared to all the synthetic stuff that we've tried. Of course they work fine, but if you want the utmost control, these are the ones to go for. And lastly, there are no brushes that follows shape quite as well as Kolinsky sable brushes do. They pretty much just flow perfectly into every crevice, follows shape like nothing else. But you don't need that fine control for every step of the miniature, because if you want these to last as long as possible, you just use these for the highlights and for the fine details. And this is true for any Kolinsky sable brand, whether you're using the Squidmar brushes that I'm doing today, or you're using Da Vinci, Winsor & Newton, or Raphael. It's all the same natural hair from Kolinsky sable. Which one of these brands you get is more a matter of personal taste. The use should be pretty much the same. It's more about which shape you prefer, how long you want them, how thick you want the bellies to be, etc. If we instead compare these to synthetic brushes that are machine made by a mechanical process that mechanically makes the bristles hold together, these brushes can be pushed to the sides quite a lot and honestly still hold the tip quite okay, especially for what it is. They do not require the same gentle handling, you can be a lot more fierce when using them, and it doesn't matter as much if you don't have as much moistness in them. So when you want to paint in a tight area and you want to be able to reach into those nooks and crannies without being afraid of breaking the bristles or breaking the hairs, synthetic brushes will shine for you. For anything that doesn't require the same amount of detail or quality, a synthetic brush is where I go. And that also makes my Kolinsky sable brushes last much longer. And keep in mind guys, all of this, learning how much moistness is good, how much I have to add, how wet I keep the paint, how wet I keep the palette, it takes time to learn. And all that hand-eye coordination and just getting a feel for how the brush works, it takes a lot of time. All of these things that I've taught you, of course, can be broken. Rules are meant to be broken when it comes to art, but getting a good control first and then breaking the rules is better than just start breaking the rules and not getting any control of what you're doing. And then use those broken rules to make an as artistic piece as you want to do. But now guys, thanks so much for watching. A massive thanks to this week's sponsor, as well as our lovely patrons. We love you guys. With that said, have a great day. Bye bye.